Ladies and gentlemen, often in my spare time, I find myself wasting time on the internet. I go on Facebook, and maybe you're guilty of doing the same. Maybe you also watch these tedious videos of kittens jumping about and little animals, puppies, cute little creatures doing this, that, and the other. So that's quite a waste of time, but recently, whilst scrolling down my newsfeed on Facebook, I came across a more interesting video. I saw the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, greeting the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. You may well have seen this video yourselves. It was released roughly 2 weeks ago. And what you see in the video is the President of the Commission greeting the Hungarian Prime Minister with the word dictator. So this got me thinking about dictatorships. I thought, what exactly is a dictatorship? What is a dictator? How many dictatorships do we have in the world? Now, despite the comment that Jean-Claude Juncker made, I actually think that Hungary is not really a dictatorship, or not yet, at least. It's not quite there. And it is also my belief that the President of the Commission doesn't think in his real heart of hearts that it's a dictatorship either. Hungary hasn't quite reached the stage of becoming a dictatorship yet, but it does have severe restrictions on press freedom, and there are restrictions on individual liberties. And this is all in our continent, in Europe. But in Europe we have indeed had many dictatorships, and not too long ago. For example, my own grandma was alive at the time of the most notorious of all European dictators. And here, of course, I'm talking about none other than Adolf Hitler. And many countries which are now part of the EU only managed to shake off the yoke of dictatorship a few short decades ago. Here I'm particularly thinking of Spain under Franco, Portugal under Salazar, and Greece under its military junta. And these dictatorships all more or less came to an end in the 1970s, so not that long ago at all, really. Now, with these dictatorships I've just mentioned, well, with hindsight and the benefit of historical analysis, we can say that all of these were clear examples of dictatorships. We can clearly define what a dictatorship is, and we can say that all of these forms of rule were indeed dictatorships. But it can often be difficult to distinguish between a government which is just very authoritarian and a true, fully fledged dictatorship. It's often difficult to know where to draw the line. And that's above all the case when we're talking about regimes that still exist nowadays and rulers who are still in power. For example, many would claim that the late Hugo Chavez of Venezuela was a dictator, whereas others would point to the fact that time and again he was democratically elected in the ballot box, and each time he received a large majority. Now, the terms dictator and dictatorship can, of course, be subjective. They can be quite hard to define. But, as I said, dictatorships have been defined, and we have been able to classify certain regimes in the past as clearly being dictatorships. So what is the definition that is used? Well, in the academic world nowadays, there are indeed measurable definitions that are used, objective definitions. Most experts who study dictatorships start with one simple definition. They say that when there is no turnover in power, when there is no change at the helm of a government, when there is no change in the executive branch of government, then here we're talking about a dictatorship. Typically, dictatorships depend on relatively few people to keep them in power. The people who prop up a dictator and keep him in his position are in most cases very few in number, and in many cases they represent an elite. In some countries, the number of people who have a real say in who stays in power can be as low as a dozen or maybe a few hundred. Dictatorships may include some degree of state terror, but this is not always the case. However, one thing is clear according to researchers. A dictatorship almost always involves state funds being siphoned off for a select group of cronies, a select group of collaborators. And when you depend on the support of very few people in order for you to maintain your power, then the efficient way to govern is, of course, through corruption, bribery, blackmail, extortion, and so forth. You can keep a very small group of people very loyal if you're able to pay them very well and reward them for their loyalty. And that's how dictatorships tend to function. So given this setup of power, a dictator who wants to remain at the top of the heap doesn't work on behalf of the larger population, but rather for the benefit of a handful of people, and he depends on these people in order to maintain control. And this leads me on to a very interesting point, possibly the most interesting point that I can share with you today on this topic. Dictatorships are not actually a result of the bad luck of one country in just having one psychopath who decides to take power. It's not simply that one country is more unlucky than another in having a megalomaniac deciding to take control. Rather than that, it is actually the political structure in place in a country which allows for dictatorial behavior to take place. Even after dictators pay off their cronies, after they pay enough money to the right people in order to keep their grip on power, there still tends to be a lot of money left over, which is supposedly for paying for services, public services, paying for infrastructure to be built, etc. And this is where the character of a dictator is truly put to the test. A dictator can decide to follow one of two paths. He can either ferret away the money for his own good, for to amass his own fortunes, or he can decide to spend this money on improving the welfare, the well-being of his citizens. And there are indeed many dictators who do decide to invest in their population to help the people that they have under their control. But that doesn't necessarily mean that things will go well. Having genuinely good intentions for society does not necessarily translate into having actual good ideas for implementing those intentions. And this has been disastrously demonstrated time and again over the years. In many cases, authoritarian leaders have made their subjects worse off. And if it is simply up to one person to make decisions for society, then that one person is bound to get it wrong more than once. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have a lot more to say on the topic, but I feel that maybe we could take a quick break here and we'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.